2, 3. Left my fear by the side of the room to hear you speak. I won't let go. Fall to my knees as I lift my hands to pray. Got every reason to be here again. The Father's love, it draws me in, and all my eyes wanna see is a glimpse of you. But all I need is you. All I need is you, Lord. It's you, Lord. All I need is you. All I need is you, Lord. It's you, Lord. One more day and it's not the same. Your spirit calls our heart to sing, drawn to the voice of a Savior once again. Where would my soul be without your Son? He gave his life to save the earth. Rest in the thought that you're watching over me, and all I need is you. All I need is you, Lord. It's you, Lord. All I need is you. All I need is you, Lord. It's you, Lord. All I need is you. All I need is you, Lord. It's you, Lord. And all I need is you. All I need is you. And all I need is you. All I need is you. You hold the universe. You hold everyone on earth. You hold the universe. You
were singing over me. You have been so, so good to me. Before I took a breath, you breathed your life in me. You have been so, so kind to me. And all the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. Oh, it chases me down, fights till I'm found, leaves a 99. I couldn't earn it, I don't deserve it, still you give yourself away. Oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. Yeah. When I was your foe, still your love fought for me. You have been so, so good to me. When I felt no worth, you paid it all for me. You have been so, so kind to me. And all the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. Oh, it chases me down, fights till I'm found, leaves a 99. I couldn't earn it, I don't deserve it, still you give yourself away. Oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. Yeah. There's no shadow you won't light up, mountain you won't climb up, coming after me. There's no wall you won't kick down, lie you won't tear down, coming after me. There's no shadow you won't light up, mountain you won't climb up, coming after me. There's no wall you won't kick down, lie you won't tear down, coming after me. There's no shadow you won't light up, mountain you won't climb up, coming after me. There's no wall you won't kick down, lie you won't tear down, coming after me. There's no shadow you won't light up, mountain you won't climb up, coming after me. There's no wall you won't kick down, lie you won't tear down, coming after me. Oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. Oh, it chases me down, fights till I'm found, leaves a 99. I couldn't earn it, I don't deserve it, still you give yourself away. his portion, and he is our prize. Drawn to redemption by the grace in his eyes. If grace is an ocean, we're all sinking. So heaven meets earth like a sloppy wet kiss, and my heart turns violently inside of my chest. And I don't have time to maintain these regrets when I think about the way that he loves us. Oh, how he loves us. Oh, how he loves us. Oh, how he loves. And he loves us. Oh, how he loves us. Oh, how he loves us. Oh, how he loves. Yeah, he loves.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Catalyst. My name is Matt Bogomil, and I'm bringing you our messages this week from the Adirondack Park. Little sight, some of the high peaks behind me, but it's a very cool reminder that God's church has no walls, truly, and that we can reach anybody, anywhere. I know we always have been able to with prayer, but now it's with sort of a Zoom church and online. We could really grow our church in a way that we haven't been able to before. Also, our first announcement, it ties to that with our life groups. We are doing our life groups over Zoom right now, and all that information is found on our website. So I encourage you to take a look, see what groups are out there, and I encourage you to join one too. It's just really cool time for fellowship and really strengthening relationships with each other. Number 2, Orange Kids. Our weekly Catalyst email update has a link to the Bible message in there, and that is for the Orange Kids group. Number 3, if you'd like to tithe during this time, it's still the same way we've always done, is through the PushPay app. So if you can download, our app, if you're on either Google Play or the App Store, you just search Catalyst Vineyard, and it's like the very first thing that pops up. So one more view of the mountains for you outdoor people. But welcome to Catalyst, and enjoy the message.
Good morning. Welcome to Catalyst. So today we're starting a new 6-part series entitled Don't Settle. And when I came up for that title, it made me remember a video that I made for the 1989 first NCAA championship team I coached at Ithaca College. And I drove all the way to Long Island to do a highlight video because I didn't know how to do one, and I had to go somewhere where someone knew, and I found out there was someone there that knew, so I drove to Long Island. And when we were picking songs for it, one of the songs that we picked was a song from Madonna from her album called Express Yourself, and it was in 1989, and the album song was Don't Go for Second Best, or sort of Don't Settle. And I thought about that when I thought about this series, and if you look at the definition of what it is to settle is to choose to what is safe or easy over what is risky or costly. And we all have the tension of those decisions in our life, don't we? There's always those times where we're saying, this would be so much easier to do. That's really risky to do. But maybe if I do that, there'll be a great return. And we live inside the tension between settling for safe and easy over risky and costly. But, if we think about it, most of the valuable things in our life, most of the things that we hold on to the most are when we've taken a risk, or when we've invested ourselves in something that was not easy. Maybe it's our finances, maybe it's relationships, maybe it's your faith, but it's so key to not settle for less. Maybe you're making the decision, one of the classic ones is should I pursue a relationship with this person? And maybe if it's a marriage type relationship, maybe the person is not a Christian and you are. And Paul talks about not being unequally yoked, and you have to wrestle with that decision on, am I going to just settle because I need to get a guy or I need to get a girl? And we all wrestle with these things. And as we find ourselves in the midst of a pandemic, a worldwide pandemic, and in all kinds of socioeconomic upheaval going on in our lives, a lot of us are finding that we wish that we could return to the old normal, don't we? I mean, we find ourselves wanting to go back to normal. And that's something that I've heard so many people say, hey, I am so over this. And really what they're saying is, I want things to go back the way they were. And so as we think about that, is that really what we want? Is this pandemic been for you a pause where you've been able to grow relationally with some people that you're sheltered with? Or has it been a time when you've been able to get things done that you normally can't get done in a busier world? Or maybe you've been able to clean out your closet or clean out your garage or your basement? Or maybe you've been under tremendous stress, financial stress. Maybe you're under stress with trying to teach your kids at home, and now you're thinking, oh no, it could happen again, and you're wondering what's going to happen with school, and you've been wearing a mask and trying to find things that you normally could find at Wegmans, and you can't find them now because the shelves are wiped out, and we're going through all this stress. And aren't we all ready for things to go back to normal? Aren't we all so over this? But what I want to make sure that I point out today is that in light of what we're experiencing, in light of what we're learning, it would be a shame to go back to normal. In fact, that's why you hear so many people now talking about the new normal. And when we say the new normal, we're often led to think, well, what's that going to look like? I mean, what's that going to look like for work? Am I going to be able to keep working from home, to be a remote worker? What's it going to look like for school? Are my kids hopefully going to go back to school? What's it going to look like for sports? And we're beginning to see announcements along these ways, and some of them are really disappointing. What's going to happen with NFL football? What's going to happen with church? What's going to happen with Catalyst? We're all wrestling with these things and thinking about what's the new normal going to look like. And before we move on to the new normal, if we're wise, I think we take a pause and we ask some questions. And one of them is, what have we learned? And what do we want to carry forward? What have we learned, and what do we want to carry forward? What have we learned in the midst of this pandemic that we want to carry forward with us? And here's something that I've learned, and maybe some of you other folks have thought about this, but those of you who were around in the 80s, or maybe have watched some reruns, there was a sci-fi film, 3 of them actually, with Mel Gibson, and it was called Mad Max. Some of you remember that? And here's what I would think at this point, that Mad Max, the producers of that really had it wrong. As they were describing the societal breakdown, murder, revenge during this apocalyptic time, what they sort of presented us with is that oil was the most valuable commodity you could have. But it's not actually oil that's the most valuable commodity, it's toilet paper, right? Have any of you gone to the grocery store and tried to get toilet paper, particularly at the beginning of this thing? It was crazy. And I think all of us were saying, why toilet paper? I sort of understand it, but I sort of don't. Why are people hoarding it? And so if we're going to do a new series, if these producers rethink things and they realize that toilet paper is the most valuable commodity, perhaps the new film could be called Game of Thrones. And so I know some of you are laughing and some of you are saying, why did he say that? Anyways, the thing that we can learn from this, though, from this time, and the question that we all ought to be asking ourselves is, how can we be better for it? How can we use what we're experiencing right now and be better for it? And really, how can we be better for this COVID-19 crisis, what some people are calling a plague? How can we be better having witnessed the horrific death of George Floyd? How can we be better as we're wrestling with some of the issues around racial injustice, and we're watching protests, and we're watching senseless, destruction of property and looting, and we're trying to find our way through this? How can we use this time period to be better for it and to go to a new normal instead of trying to go back to our old normal? And see, our traditions may return. At some point, this will end, and things will return in some respects. But how will we change? How will we make sure that we are not going to experience this pain without having a gain? Because pain without gain would be a shame. To go through this period of time and not get better for it, I think would be a shame. And if we don't ask ourselves the questions that we're going to be looking at today, I think that we could tend to settle for the old normal. And we could tend to not think about how could we get better. And as we're asking those questions, and as we're looking at our circumstances today, I want you to think about what is the thing that could become your new normal. What are you learning right now during this time period? And we're going to take a look at some verses from a book by a guy by the name of Clive Staples Lewis. You all know who he is, right? And you're like thinking, never heard of him. But you probably heard of C.S. Lewis, because C.S. Lewis was the British author that was also a lay theologian, and he was a teacher at Oxford. And what C.S. Lewis did was provide us with some great fiction and some great nonfiction. And he wrote some great fiction books. In fact, quite frankly, 3 of the only fiction books I've ever read are the Chronicles of Narnia, an amazing series that he put together. And then he wrote the Screwtape Letters. And then he also wrote a book called Mere Christian. But today we're going to take a look at some writings, or a section of the writing of his book called The Problem of Pain. And so let's take a look at this. And so what Lewis says is this: my own experience is something like this. I am progressing along the path of life in my ordinary, contentedly fallen and godless condition, absorbed in a merry meeting with my friends for the morrow, or a bit of work that tickles my vanity. When suddenly, in other words, life is normal, and suddenly a stab of abdominal pain that threatens serious disease hits me. Maybe it's clutching your chest with feeling like you're having a heart attack, or a headline in the newspaper that threatens us all with destruction, and we've been reading those. Sends the whole pack of cards come tumbling down. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I think all of us, or most of us, have experienced in our life some moment or time when things came tumbling down, where our normal was challenged by something that was not inside our normal, when something disrupted our world. And that's really what a lot of us have been experiencing here. And if you've ever experienced your life come tumbling down, it typically opens up your eyes and your mind to ask questions. And Lewis goes on and he says this, he says, at first I am overwhelmed and all my little happiness look like broken toys. In other words, what he was doing wasn't looking so good. Then slowly and reluctantly, bit by bit, I try to bring myself into the frame of mind that I should be in at all times. And C.S. Lewis begins to describe something that we should always be doing. Let me read the writings of Paul. If you're a follower of Jesus, it says that we should rejoice in the Lord at all times. But do we really do that? That in everything we should be giving thanks, that we should have perfect peace in our life. And reading on, he says this, and perhaps by God's grace, I succeed for a day or two. In other words, I start to turn the corner. I start to go into this place of peace, become a creature consciously dependent on God and drawing strength from the right sources. And then he says this, he says, but the moment the threat is withdrawn, that moment the threat of something bad happening is withdrawn. And we already know what comes next, don't we? We've already had this in the story of our lives. And the reason we know it is we've experienced it. And we know that if we don't change because of this threat, when it is withdrawn, if we don't change when somebody says to you, hey, if you don't change, I'm done. It's over. If you don't change, you're fired. You know, or the doctor turns to you after a physical and he says, if you don't start changing your life, what you're eating, your exercise, whatever it might be, if you don't start doing that, we're going to have a big problem. You know, you're going to develop diabetes, you're going to develop heart issues, or you're going to have this or that problem. And after we've had this threat of being fired, or this scary physical, or whatever kind of close call, maybe you're holding your cell phone while you're driving and talking to somebody, and you almost have a huge accident. It was a close call. And the question is, but the moment the threat is withdrawn, what do we do? I mean, and I think most of us know the answer to that. And here's what Lewis says next. He says, my whole nature leaps back to the toys God has had for me for but 48 hours. In other words, I didn't change for long. And not only by dint, or i.e. the threat of taking everything else away from me, that I begin to turn. let him sheath or let him stay the sword for just a moment. In other words, when the threat subsides, when that thing that we think is going to happen is no longer in front of us, what do? He goes on, he says this, and I behave like a puppy when the hated bath is over. And I think many of us have given a bath to a dog. And if you've ever done that, dogs don't like baths, or at least not the ones that I've had. Maybe a Labrador would like a bath, but dogs don't generally like baths. I mean, they're standing there looking at you like, how do I get here and how do I get out of here? And he says that he behaves like a puppy when the hated bath is over. He shakes himself dry, and I think some of us have seen that, and he gets as dry as he can. He races off to reacquire his comfortable dirtiness. If not in the nearest manure heap, at least in the nearest flower bed. And so the picture here is sometimes when we see the consequences of how we're living our life, maybe it's the consequences of sin, of missing the mark in our life, of doing something in a relationship or doing something financially or on a personal level that isn't going to be good for our long haul. When we're in that situation and suddenly a threat catches our attention and we begin to work on changing, sometimes when the threat is removed, we just go back to what we were doing before. And I think the picture of a flower heap is sort of interesting because it almost presents it like, well, that's not too bad to do. I mean, that would be like me saying, I could still have those potato chips. I could, we go back. I mean, I'm struggling with that. I'm trying to get to an ideal weight. And, it's totally doable. But the path along the way, I have to keep making these decisions if I'm going to go back to that flower bed or even maybe the manure heap. And we ask ourselves, what is wrong with us? I mean, what is wrong with me? I mean, why do I make these crazy decisions that aren't good decisions? Well, why do we have to be brought to the brink of disaster before we're willing to make changes and make changes that we know we need to make? I mean, why do we have to be brought to the edge of the cliff? And I think it's really all about human nature wants to go back to the old normal. And right now, in the middle of this pandemic, in the middle of all this upheaval we're experiencing, I think most of us just say, I'm so over this. Can't we just flip the switch and go back to the way things were? Should we settle? Should we settle? Isn't that what we ask ourselves? Can't we just settle for what was? But here's the deal. Aspiring to normal is not very inspiring. Aspiring to normal is not like asking ourselves, shouldn't we be doing something better? Can't we use this as an opportunity, like looking at ourselves in a mirror and seeing things that need to change and actually doing something about it, actually setting some goals to change? I mean, so back to the question that we'll be asking all through this series. How can we be better for it? How can we be better for it? How can we resist the temptation to settle and go back to our old normal? And we've all heard the saying, don't let a good thing go to waste, right? Well, in this case today, I'm saying, don't let a bad thing go to waste. Don't let something that seems like a bad thing that you're experiencing right now, and I don't want to discount anybody's experience, because some of us have experienced death with a loved one. Some of us have experienced someone being near death in a hospital. I just watched a video about that on Sunday, where someone was talking about, with his wife beside him, how close he was to death at 50 years of age, younger than I am. And it's not too soon to start asking the questions that I think can help us through this time of crisis. And so here's one to ask. What have I been doing that almost led to my undoing? If I'm trying to figure out what could be better, what have I been doing that almost led to my undoing? Is there something you experienced during this time period that became a big problem? And that sort of unveiled something you were doing that was really a problem? Or on the flip side of that, what should I begin doing that I should have been doing all along? What should I begin doing? In other words, is it become clear that there's something you haven't been doing that you really should have been doing? And in today's message on Don't Settle for Pain Without Gain, I want to address three specific areas of our lives, 3 areas that we can sort of ask ourselves a question and try to figure out where we're at. And so question number 1 is, how can we be better financially? And maybe this pandemic has had no impact on your finance. Maybe you're working for Amazon. Or maybe you're working, if you're working in my retail store selling rubber hex dumbbells, you're busy. You're doing great. I mean, if you're selling Olympic bars, I was talking with a manufacturer of bars yesterday that just got an order for 4,000 bars a month. I mean, there's crazy demand in some areas, but maybe you've been laid off. Maybe you've been furloughed. Maybe you had a pay cut happen. Or maybe you're not sure what's going to happen with the company that you're working for. Maybe you feel like you're under risk. And you really need to stand back and say, what have I been doing that almost led to my undoing financially? Or what do you wish you'd been doing financially that you weren't doing as you look through this pandemic? And so whether the answer is for you, whatever the answer is for you for those two questions, here's my challenge. I want you to begin now. Because we all tend to say, you know what, I can't deal with that right now, coach. I mean, I got too many other things in my mind. I mean, I'm dealing with too much stuff, but now is the time to begin to address what we're clearly seeing. Now is the time to be better for what we're seeing. And here's two financial realities that I think we all need to embrace. And this is not rocket science. These are two financial realities. The first one is, I want is better than I owe. And if you've ever taken a course like Financial Peace University, you've learned this stuff. I mean, I want is better than I owe. What does that mean? There's a tension between what we want and what we can afford. But it's better to leave yourself wanting than to spend more than you can afford and leave yourself owing. Debt is a tremendous burden. And if you're in debt, and I've been in debt, Kathy and I have been in debt. You know, we've overused credit cards in the past. You know, we've had to be bailed out, quite frankly. Bailed out by my father after I was married. I mean, so I've experienced that. But what I'm going to tell you is far better to feel the tension of I want than to feel the tension of I owe. Because I owe is a lonely place to be. Number two, a financial hole is due in part to a lack of self-control. Before the crisis, you might have been saying, if only I had more money. But now you might be saying, if only I'd saved more money. And that's the kind of experience a crisis can bring on you. When there's financial pressure, you start thinking less about what you're making, but more about what you have in hand. And particularly if you lose your job. And here's a powerful word picture that was written by one of the wisest men of all time, King Solomon, third king of Israel. And he wrote this in Proverbs. He says, like a city whose walls are broken through is a person who lacks self-control. How amazing is that statement? I mean, he gives us a picture of a city walls, and in the time that he was writing, the walls of a city were the total protection of that city. And if a wall was broken down, they were very vulnerable for someone to come in, for an enemy to come in and to cause havoc. And the security and the safety of a city depended on the integrity of its walls. And Solomon is saying, you know what? If you don't have the right walls in your life, you know, things are not going to go well. In fact, you know, a loss of self-control is going to actually lead to a loss of control. And nobody wants to experience that. I mean, we've all experienced times in our life where we've lost control. And when that happens, it's probably good to think about, was there a place that I let myself open for this? Was there a place of self-control? You know, of self-discipline, of a decision I could have made, an intentional decision that would have prevented this. And now is the time to start to think about the walls in our life. You know, as you're feeling pressure, it's a good time to take an assessment and sort of walk around the walls like Nehemiah did and sort of see, is there an area in my life I need to shore up? Is there an area in my life that I need to be better and maybe not settle for less? So on this topic of how can we be better for it financially, in making the right decisions, I mean, here's some things to think about. Save more, and that's not rocket science, is it? We all know we need to save more. I mean, we all know or have probably heard you should have 3 to 6 months of your expenses in the bank, in savings, liquid. Not in stocks, but actually liquid to be able to use. How many of us have done that? Have you done that? Have you actually put aside at least 3 months in the bank so that if things go bad, if you lose your job or if a crisis comes up, you're able to weather the storm? You have walls that have been built that won't break down. And spend less. I mean, don't we all know we should be on a budget? And I'm going to tell you, I struggle with the budget because there's a part of me that likes to just sort of not be constrained by that wall. But the reality of it is, if you don't have some way that you're marking how you're spending and keeping within your means, you're going to end up with a broken wall financially in your life. And probably the one that's most critical of all, most important of all, is get out and stay out of debt. Because if you've let your wall get broken down and things have flooded in and you owe money, that is not a good place to be. That is not a good place to experience. Begin the pathway out of that. Make that a priority in your life. Question number 2. Ask yourself, how can we be better for it relationally? How can we be better for this relationally, for this experience we're going through? And how can I be better for it in my marriage or in my dating relationship? Or how can I be better for it in the relationship I have with my kids? And particularly those who are in families who have been sheltering together, who have been in this quarantine status with one another, and as we all try to be distant from our non-close family relationships. And if you've been in that situation, I think it's a great time to ask, how's it going? How is it going in that? In other words, I talk to some people and they're like, this is amazing. I'm eating dinner every night with the kids, and my wife and I are closer than ever. And to be honest with you, for me, it's been a very good experience for Kathy and I. I think it's given us more time together, less distraction around us as we shelter in. But for some of us, that may not be the experience. This period of time of being closer together may be causing the cracks in your relationships to sort of come to the surface. And this sheltering may be highlighting those things, both the good and the bad in your relationships, and also with your kids. And so here would be my advice. If you're finding that your relationships are having conflicts during this time, make sure that you own your slice of the pie. Make sure that you hone up to what is really yours to own. In other words, you could look at the conflict that you're experiencing as a catalyst that saves your marriage or that repairs the relationship that you have had with your son or daughter. I mean, this time could be a valuable time if we use it now, if we don't wait, if we use it now to get better. Final question, number 3. How can we be better for it personally? And when I say personally, I'm talking about internally. I'm talking about in our hearts. The Bible talks about our heart. It talks about our soul. It even talks about our inner man. That's what Paul said. He said it's your inner man. And to some degree, it's your worldview. It's how you're viewing the world that you're living with. And in some respect, it's the spiritual glasses that you're wearing. Because we all have a set of glasses on. We're all viewing the world with a certain set of glasses. Sort of like what C.S. Lewis was writing about. We all have a certain set of glasses on and we're reacting in a certain way. And what I'm saying is, ask yourself how you can be better spiritually for what you're experiencing. And also, sort of ask yourself, has my foundation been rocked? Has this pandemic or has the things that have proceeded from the death of George Floyd or some of the things we're watching on television or some of the things we're seeing up close, what have they done in your life? Have they rocked you in a way that you're wrestling with God questions? I mean, maybe if you're not a believer, you're wrestling with questions about God. You're asking those questions maybe for the first time or the first time in a long time, or you've begun praying. I mean, you find yourself, and I talk with a lot of people, that this experience has made them ask these questions. Or maybe they're saying, hey, could you pray with me? And they weren't someone who was asking for prayer previously. It's sort of this period of time under pressure where we begin to look and think about, is there something more? And if you are a believer, or if you have been a follower of Christ, or if you call yourself a Christian, have you discovered that your faith was more fragile than you imagined? Have you discovered that you are now all of a sudden asking yourself questions like, why, God? How could you let this happen, God? Because some of us, and not all of us, but some of us have experienced terrible things during this time period. Some of us are really struggling during this time period. And if that's true, that you're asking those questions, my advice would be pay attention to the tension. Pay attention to what's coming to the surface in a sense, because it could lead to something bad and it could lead to something good. And it's really a matter of how we handle that tension, almost like looking back to what C.S. Lewis was saying. How do we react when the pressure is removed? How are we going to react then? And here's a quote that states something that can be true of really all of us. There's a gal named Kate Bowler who wrote a book called Everything Happens for a Reason and Other Lies I've Believed. And in this book, she says this: there's a little prosperity gospel in all of us. And I think all of us know a little bit about what is the prosperity gospel. It's this gospel that promises you're going to be rich, and you're going to have this, and you're going to have that, and it's all about you. And it's this gospel that says that good things happen to good people, and bad things happen to bad people. And it's a false gospel narrative. It's not the gospel that Paul preached. It's not the gospel that Peter preached. It's not the gospel that Jesus brought. It's a false gospel that suggests that we sort of earn our way through life and that God owes us, or karma owes us, or somebody owes us. There's a sense in which, well, if I do this, I should get that. And if that has been your view in any way, to any degree, and I think it's true, there is a little bit of that in all of us, in our faith life. If that's true of you, and I would say this: if your world's been rocked, you should learn something from it. And if the current events have left you with these God questions, you should pay attention. And if you're considering yourself a Christian, if you consider yourself a Jesus follower, it may cause you to finally give up on a faith in a non-existent God who doesn't allow bad things to happen to good people. And it may actually allow you to discover the true God who allowed the worst possible thing to happen to the best possible person, Jesus, for us. In other words, he allowed the worst possible thing to happen to Jesus, to die on the cross, to be buried for 3 days. He allowed all of that to happen so that he could have a relationship with us. That's the true God. That's the true gospel. And so in this season of pain, let's take the advice of Jesus's advice through James. So James was the brother of Jesus, and he wrote a letter to the Jewish believers that were throughout the Roman Empire that had been sort of scattered around. They were Jewish Christians, you could say. And here's what he says right off the bat in his first chapter. He says this in verses 2-4. My fellow believers, when it seems as though you are facing nothing but difficulties or trials, see it as an invisible opportunity or a test to experience the greatest joy that you can. For you know that when your faith is tested, it stirs up power within you to endure all things. I think we've all experienced that moment in time when we're getting in shape, where we're growing in our faith, when we're becoming mature. And that as your endurance grows even stronger, it will release perfection into every part of your being until there is nothing missing and nothing lacking. Some translations say that you will be fully mature. So finally, let's ask ourselves in the midst of this COVID-19 crisis, let's all ask ourselves, how will I be better for it? How am I going to come out on the other side of this? What is going to be the new normal instead of going back to the old normal? And you know, I would recommend that we also say, what will help me remember this crisis? I mean, maybe I think it would be good for us to get a physical object, sort of like the Israelites did as they were going through the wilderness and certain things God did for them. They would build something that would be a monument to what God had done. Maybe we need to all get something to help us remember to not settle and to be better. Something that would help us to tune in our inner man, our worldview, to a true view of who God is. And so let's don't miss this unprecedented opportunity that we're in right now. And we're in something that hopefully we'll only experience once in our lifetime. But let's not experience pain without gain, because that would be a shame. And let's not return to our manure heaps or to the flower beds that C.S. Lewis was talking about. Please, let's all consider to not settle. And let's pray. Father, I just lift up right now every person who is joining us in this message today. And I just pray, Father, who you would help them see how they can be better through what we're experiencing right now. You know every life. You know every need. You know every experience. And I just pray in the name of Jesus that you would show us all how to gain from the pain that some of us are experiencing and how to be better as we come out of this into something that becomes something new, that we have a new normal in front of us. Amen.